As the day of February 15th, 1801 drew to a close, America would breathe a sigh of relief. An election that had captivated the nation for 3 months had finally been concluded. The Electoral College had resulted in a tie, handing the job of electing the president to the bitterly divided House of Representatives. 35 ballots had been cast in the House, and each yielded the same result: a tie. Neither side agreed to compromise. Threats of a civil war broke out, and state governors threatened to march with their militias and even secede if the election did not go in their way. In the end, one man would reluctantly make a decision that would decide the fate of the election as well as the nation. The election of 1800 has been labeled by some as a revolution. Others vehemently disagree with this label, believing it to be overblown, but in a sense it can be called true. Whether for better or for worse, the election of 1800 revolutionized the bloodthirstiness of American political campaigns. The candidates understood the immense importance and power of the presidency, and they and their supporters were prepared to do everything possible to win the office, even if that meant smearing and blatantly lying about the opposition. This was something that had never been seen before in American politics, and it would truly change the way that campaigns were run. Now, in order for you to understand the election of 1800, you need a bit of background information. Well, maybe a bit more than a bit. In the first 2 presidential elections, George Washington won unanimous support. Being the hero of the American Revolution, there was little to no disagreement over him being elected president. It was during the Washington administration that a clear political divide began to emerge. The main divide was between the 2 different ways of viewing the nation's new and contentious Constitution. Alexander Hamilton and others believed that the Constitution should be followed more loosely. People with this view were known as the Federalists, and along with their viewpoint on the Constitution, another core belief of theirs was in a strong, centralized federal government. Those who stood in opposition to the Federalists were known, quite fittingly, as the Anti-Federalists, or the Democratic Republicans. Rallied around Thomas Jefferson, they favored a stricter interpretation of the Constitution and believed in more powerful states rather than a strong central government. Another interesting difference between the 2 political parties was the Federalists' general preference for Britain and the Democratic Republicans' preference for France, which later would become a major point of contention. Jumping forward a bit to the election of 1796, we see the first election that really pitted these 2 factions against each other. To clarify, these were not political parties as we picture them nowadays. A more rigid and organized party system, like we have today, would not become the norm for quite a while. Instead, these factions were more or less unofficial groups of men with similar interests, intent on electing individuals who shared their views. When it came to choosing who to vote for president, the leaders of these factions held informal meetings where they would agree on who they would all vote for president and vice president. In the end, the Federalists agreed on voting for then Vice President John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans for Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Now, if you've ever paid attention to a modern presidential election, you've probably heard of the Electoral College. Well, in 1796, the election process was actually slightly different from how it is now. Each state would have as many electoral votes, or electors, as they had senators and representatives. What's really interesting, though, is that states could choose electors however they pleased, via state legislature, popular vote, etc. Now, each of these electors were given 2 votes that they could cast for 2 separate people. Whichever candidate received the most votes would be president, and the second place candidate would become his vice president. However, the Constitution did not differentiate, at the time, between the election of president and vice president, which made there be a chance that 2 political adversaries could be elected to both positions. Assuming that political factions compromised and agreed on both president and vice presidents, this wouldn't be much of a problem, because whichever faction had more electors would simply win both races. I say races, but again, it was all one race, but simply for both first and second place. When election day arrived and all the electoral votes had been cast, the potential became reality. Federalist John Adams was elected president, and Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson was elected his vice president. The final vote tally was razor thin, with 71 electoral votes cast for Adams and 68 for Jefferson. The narrowness of this race really shows how closely divided American politics was, even at such an early stage. It seems that while most electors in their respective factions committed to voting for their agreed-upon presidential candidate, their votes were all over the place for the second vote. After the election, Jefferson supporters allegedly taunted President-elect Adams with the cry, "President by 3 votes." This, in a way, would come back to bite Jefferson in the next election to come. In the lead-up to the election of 1800, there were several events that formed a very heated political environment. Over in France, the monarchy had been overthrown. Thomas Jefferson deeply sympathized with the French revolutionaries, seeing a clear similarity with the American Revolution. When war broke out between France and Great Britain, the Federalists took the side of the latter, with the Democratic Republicans inherently supporting France, America's first ally. This war had a direct effect on the United States. Both nations were seeking many supplies from the United States, but at the same time, Britain was attempting to block ships trading with France. This resulted in a series of seizures of American ships and even sailors. Things weren't looking great, and many believed that war between the United States and either or both countries was inevitable. Now, with the United States seemingly being forcibly pulled into this war, in 1795, when Washington was still president, he signed the Jay Treaty with Great Britain. The Jay Treaty, named after its U.S. negotiator and Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, John Jay, officially established American neutrality in the European War. What's rather interesting is that this treaty was incredibly unpopular in the United States. The British said that they would provide compensation for their illegal seizures of American ships, but they did not stop seizing American ships trading with France altogether. Democratic Republicans vilified the treaty. They still favored Republican France and believed that this treaty signaled Federalists being too closely aligned with Britain. Understandably, France viewed the Jay Treaty as being completely insulting. They firmly believed that they deserved America's support in return for aiding them in the American Revolution. Outraged by their actions, France started seizing US ships trading with Britain, and by the end of 1978, they had seized more than 300 ships. In reaction to the growing tensions with France, recently inaugurated President John Adams delivered a strong speech to Congress requesting funding for a military buildup for a possible war with France. Even though Adams was truly preparing for a full-scale war, his goal was still to do his best to prevent it. Hoping to avoid a war that the new nation most likely couldn't win, Adams sent peace commissioners to negotiate with France. When the 3 men sent to negotiate, Elbridge Gerry, Charles Cotworth Pinckney, and John Marshall, finally arrived in France, they found that for some peculiar reason, they were unable to meet with the foreign minister, Marquis de Talleyrand, in person. Instead, the 3 envoys were approached by several intermediaries. These men, sent by Talleyrand, declared that the foreign minister refused to meet or even negotiate with the American envoys unless the United States provided France with a low-interest loan, pay off the American merchants angry at having their ships seized by France, and lastly, pay a rather substantial bribe to Talleyrand himself. The French, having had many successful military victories in Europe, which increased their power, began to grow cocky. They changed the terms for the loan, and also declared that if the envoys did not meet Talleyrand's demands, he would launch a full-scale invasion of the United States. When it became clear to the foreign minister that the Americans had absolutely no intention to meet his demands, he ended up dropping most of the outrageous requirements. You see, Talleyrand always intended to stop attacking US merchant ships, but he first wanted to increase his own personal wealth. However, it took some time for the news that Talleyrand had dropped the requirements to reach the United States. When Adams learned that Talleyrand had threatened invasion, he accelerated his preparations for a full-scale war with France. In the Caribbean, fighting broke out between the US Navy and the French. The Democratic Republicans, still sympathizing with the French, began to grow rather suspicious over Adams's attempts to increase military spending, and they demanded that he release the official communications between the French and American negotiators. When Adams submitted the correspondence to Congress, Talleyrand's intermediaries were initially labeled as X, Y, and Z, which is why this episode is often referred to as the XYZ affair. Adams would send a second peace mission to France, and the effort succeeded with the Treaty of Montfortain being signed in Paris on September 30th, 1800. Unfortunately for Adams, the news of this achievement failed to reach the United States prior to the conclusion of the 1800 election, leading to this quasi-war with France and the XYZ affair to still have a significant effect on its outcome. The tensions with France were not the only bit of political turmoil in the United States in the lead up to the election. Some of the most contentious policies of the Adams administration were the Alien and Sedition Acts. The former directly allowed the federal government to deport any immigrant who they happened to view as a threat to the peace or to the government without any trial or due process whatsoever. The latter gave the government the power to essentially arrest any individual who criticized the government or even the president himself. One result of this blatantly unconstitutional law was that dozens of Democratic Republicans supporting newspaper editors were arrested and jailed for stating their opposition to Adams's Federalist administration. So journalists were being jailed by a law for the crime of criticizing that very law. Yeah, that didn't go over well with a lot of people. In response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, Thomas Jefferson helped ghostwrite the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These pamphlets attempted to argue that the states could nullify a federal law that they viewed as being unconstitutional. Yet these resolutions were met with broad disapproval and condemnation. Other states insisted that such actions were radical and would surpass state authority. They believed that it was up to the court system to decide on the constitutionality of federal laws. Yet, with the Federalist executive, the judicial system was thoroughly stacked with those who would most likely uphold the majority of Federalist legislation. Even though other states condemned the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, it still ended up rousing some of Jefferson's allies. In early 1799, in Pennsylvania, a small revolt broke out against the new taxes Adams was trying to impose in order to support his goal to increase military spending. These protesters praised Jefferson and denounced the new taxes, along with the Alien Sedition Acts and President Adams. This event, organized by a man named John Fries, was suitably named Freeze Rebellion. What's most surprising about this event, though, is that it resulted in 3 people being convicted of treason and sentenced to be hanged. Along with that, 32 others were sentenced to jail time. I can't speak on whether those jailed deserved to be or not, but certainly those involved in what was basically just a small-scale riot did not deserve to be executed. Certainly, Adams seemed to agree, and he issued a blanket pardon of those involved in the event. I think that this situation is a rather scary warning about how incredibly dangerous the Sedition Act was. as well as how much it had the potential to crack down on the right to free assembly and speech. It is rather hilarious that Adams did in fact pardon those involved, because he is the man responsible for signing the Sedition Act into law. And those men being convicted of treason, well, that was simply the Sedition Act at work. Many people feared that such challenges to the federal government, as seen by Free's Rebellion as well as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, could possibly lead to civil war. It seems like many people truly believed that the nation could not survive in this state of internal division, and that it was on the verge of collapse. As the 1800 election loomed on the horizon, the two parties selected their candidates. The Federalists chose Adams for a second term, along with South Carolina's Charles Cotesworth Pinckney as his running mate, hoping that he could help pick up votes in the Democratic-Republican South. Jefferson was once again selected to lead the Democratic-Republican ticket, along with New Yorker Aaron Burr, selected to help win votes in the Federalist North. Animosity between these two factions was quite high, and every manner of attack was launched at the politics, and to a greater extent, the character of each candidate. Political hatred did not only exist between the two prominent political factions. Inter-party conflict was still quite a problem. Adams was faced with the problem of being on the bad side of the Federalist Party leader, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton had begun to despise President Adams. He felt that Adams was too willing to make concessions to France and Democratic Republicans, and was infuriated at his unwillingness to submit to him as head of the Federalist Party. In May of 1800, Adams fired his Secretary of State and Secretary of War, who had stuck around from the Washington administration, and coincidentally were more loyal to Hamilton than Adams. Hamilton came to the conclusion that John Adams was actually worse than Thomas Jefferson, and stated that, quote, "If we must have an enemy at the head of the government, let it be one who we can oppose, and from whom we are not responsible, who will not involve our party in the disgrace of his foolish and bad measures." Alexander Hamilton then began to openly seek for Adams' replacement on his party's ticket. He hoped that Adams's running mate, Charles Pinckney, being from the South, would be able to pick up more votes in the South than Adams. If Northern electors voted in equal numbers for Adams and Pinckney, Pinckney then would be able to take first place in the Electoral College, in combination with his votes in the South. To further his plans to undermine the president's re-election, he wrote a letter mainly addressed to South Carolinian Federalists, titled "The Public Conduct and Character of John Adams," which sought to destroy the man's reputation. Hamilton wrote that Adams suffered from, quote, "extreme egotism and an ungovernable temper." He claimed that there were, quote, "great and intrinsic defects in his character, and that he was eccentric and jealous-natured." To make this whole situation worse, somehow, Thomas Jefferson's running mate, Aaron Burr, got a hold of a copy of the letter and leaked it to the press, thus exposing this inter-party conflict to the whole country, much to the delight of the Democratic Republicans. In response to what Adams no doubt viewed as a sabotage of his campaign, he called Adams, quote, "the greatest intrigant in the world, a man devoid of every moral principle." Turning back to the main battle between Jefferson and Adams, both candidates faced many brutal attacks from opposing party loyalists. Federalists' favorite attack against Jefferson was the claim that he was a Jacobin, meaning a French radical. Some claim that Jefferson had obtained his property by fraud, cheated his British creditors, and robbed a widow of an estate worth £10,000. One Federalist supporter wrote that Thomas Jefferson was, quote, "a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto father, raised wholly on hoe cake, made of coarse ground southern corn, bacon and hominy, with an occasional change of fricasseed bullfrog." One of the most prominent Federalist newspapers, the Gazette of the United States, claimed that Democratic Republicans had a, quote, creed of atheism and revolution. A writer for the Connecticut Courant declared that if Jefferson was elected president, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest would all be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries and the distressed. The soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. One of the most repeated attacks on Jefferson was on his deist faith. Reverend Timothy Dwight, the president of Yale and a prominent Federalist, claimed that if Jefferson was elected, quote, we may behold a strumpet personating a goddess on the altars of Jehovah, the Bible cast into a bonfire, our children, either wheedled or terrified, united in chanting mockeries against God. We may see our wives and daughters the victims of legal prostitution. A document titled The Voice of Warning to Christians on the Ensuing Election warned that Jefferson was a man, quote, who writes against the truths of God's word, who makes not even a profession of Christianity, who is without Sabbath, without the sanctuary, without so much as a decent external respect for the faith and worship of Christians. Another writer for the Connecticut Courant wrote, quote, look at your houses, your parents, your wives, and your children. Are you prepared to see your dwellings in flames, hoary hairs bathed in blood, female chastity violated, or children writhing on the pike and the halbert? Look at every leading Jacobin as a ravening wolf, preparing to enter your peaceful fold and glut his deadly appetite on the vitals of your country. Great God of compassion and justice, shield my country from destruction. Attacks in this election were not one-sided, and Adams was victim of many smear campaigns. He was labeled as a criminal and a tyrant. Democratic Republicans accused him of wanting a national religion because of his calling for fasting and prayers during the quasi-war with France. Jefferson supporters also absurdly claimed that he wished to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George III of England, create his own American dynasty, and reunite Britain with the United States. Next, Democratic Republicans declared that Adams had sent his running mate, Charles Pinckney, to obtain 4 women from England to act as mistresses for the 2 men. In response to the accusation, Adams replied, quote, I do declare upon my honor, if this be true, General Pinckney has kept them all for himself and cheated me out of my 2. It's not completely fair to say that all of these campaigns were nothing but baseless smears and accusations. Candidates were still attacked on policy, although to a lesser degree. Federalists claimed that if Jefferson were elected, he would dismantle Hamilton's funding system, believing that the economic ramifications of which would be dire. They also claimed that Jefferson would not fight back against the ongoing French assaults on merchant ships. Democratic Republicans hit back by claiming that Federalists were warmongering and denounced their suppression of the public's dissent. One rather hilarious story during these campaigns was when Federalists started spreading a story that Jefferson had in fact died. However, their joy was cut short when it was soon discovered that the man was quite alive, and it had been a slave in Monticello by the same name who had sadly passed away. By December 3rd, the election had been going on for several weeks. Keep in mind, there was no single election day. States had been selecting their electors in their respective factions up until now, and the results clearly showed that Adams was underperforming in areas where Federalists had previously done well. Certain states had changed their ways of selecting electors to make sure that they could achieve the most favorable outcome for their party. Adams had at one point worried that there was even a chance that he would receive fewer votes than his running mate, Pinckney. No doubt something much hoped for by Alexander Hamilton. As the results poured in and a Jefferson victory looked inevitable, Jefferson wrote a letter to Aaron Burr congratulating him on his election as vice president. He claimed that while no doubt several electors had voted for himself, casting their second vote for someone other than Burr, he reassured him that he would most likely still get a few more votes than Adams. In the end, Adams ended up receiving 65 electoral votes to Pinckney's 64. Jefferson led Adams with 73, but quite surprisingly, tied with Aaron Burr. Democratic Republicans had not wished to offend Burr, so they consequently had failed to formally arrange for an elector to not vote for him, a move that would be necessary in order for Jefferson to take the lead in the Electoral College. Jefferson's letter seemed to have come back to haunt him. However, some reports alleged that Burr himself was responsible for this blunder, and that he had manipulated several electors by telling them not to drop their vote for him, falsely claiming that another elector would be doing so. Burr had been a bit of a controversial pick, and was pretty well known for his ambition, but when the Democratic-Republican ticket was agreed upon, there was no doubt that Jefferson was the head and Burr was simply his running mate. However, when the results came in as a tie, Burr seemed to imply that it was his intention to actually campaign for the presidency. With the Electoral College resulting in a tie, the ultimate fate of the election was to be decided by the House of Representatives. However, the members would vote as state delegations, with each state getting one vote, meaning that, for instance, all of the House members from the state of Virginia would all vote for either Burr or Jefferson, and then to whomever the majority of them chose, Virginia's one vote would be awarded. If the delegation's vote resulted in a tie, then they would cast a blank ballot. Many Federalists viewed this as the perfect opportunity to keep Jefferson out of office. However, one prominent Federalist had other plans. Alexander Hamilton, considered to be the head of the Federalist Party, viewed Aaron Burr as a greater threat than Thomas Jefferson, even though he disagreed more with Jefferson on policy. This stood in stark contrast to the majority of Federalists who hated Jefferson so much that they would even vote for Aaron Burr. Hamilton, in a letter to a Federalist member of the House, labeled Jefferson as a hypocrite, but conceded that he believed in a more restrained government. Burr, however, Hamilton considered to be a man driven by ambition, who had no principle whatsoever. Just gonna add this in here, if you've seen the musical Hamilton, you know very well that Aaron Burr would become responsible for Hamilton's soon-to-be death. Firmly believing that Burr could not be trusted with the power of the executive branch, and concluding that Jefferson's presidency would be less dangerous, Hamilton covertly assembled terms under which he would use his influence on the Federalist Party to support Jefferson. The main terms were that Hamilton's financial and bank system could not be disassembled, Federalist appointees could not be removed, and the US Navy had to be maintained. On February 11th, 1801, the House began to vote, but each ballot resulted in a tie, with not a single Federalist member voting for Jefferson. Rumors then began to circulate of a Federalist plot to appoint a president of their own because of the deadlock. Certain Federalists wished to prolong the voting until Inauguration Day, and then select the Federalist pro tempore of the Senate or the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court as president. Democratic Republicans claimed that Federalists were attempting to steal the election. There were additional claims that along with a Federalist coup, they would attempt to assassinate Jefferson if he attempted to assume office without the consent of the House. There were threats of an insurrection if the election was stolen from Jefferson, and the man himself is reported to have told Adams that attempts to steal the election would result in, quote, resistance by force and incalculable consequences. There were some reports that suggested Democratic Republican governors would prepare to resist with their state militias if the Federalists stole the election. Samuel Tyler informed the governor of Virginia that the governor of Pennsylvania had 22,000 men prepared for action or even secession in such an event. In response to these threats, a Federalist newspaper claimed that Massachusetts' militia of 60,000 strong would easily defeat the forces of Pennsylvania and Virginia. In the end, these threats of violence resulted in nothing. A Federalist member of the House from Delaware named James A. Bayard said he would stop voting for Burr, allowing Jefferson to win, in order to prevent any violence. Bayard was faced with making the tough decision of choosing between his party and his state. If the Union were to collapse due to the inability to select chief executive, or due to a civil war caused by the election of Burr, Bayard believed that his tiny state of Delaware most likely could not survive on its own. Having more loyalty to his state than his party, Bayard would go on to say that, quote, representing the smallest state in the Union, without resources which could furnish the means of self-protection, I was compelled by the obligation of a sacred duty, so to act as not to hazard the constitution upon which the political existence of the state depends. Later, Bayard would go on to claim that Jefferson had, indirectly, pledged to him to follow Hamilton's terms for Federalist support. But Jefferson would always maintain that he had not made any deals whatsoever. On the 36th ballot and the 5th day of voting, several Federalists, along with Bayard, did not vote. This gave Jefferson the lead with 10 state delegations to Burr's 4, with 2 states casting blank ballots. On March 4th, 1801, Thomas Jefferson was sworn in as the 3rd President of the United States of America. Adams did not attend the inauguration, having remained hidden for most of the remainder of his term. Jefferson was mocked by many Adams supporters with calls of, quote, President by no votes, a callback to the famous chant Jefferson supporters had cried to Adams 4 years earlier. During Jefferson's inauguration, he would attempt to smooth over the division caused by the bitter election, and proclaimed, quote, we are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who wish to dissolve this union or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed, as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. In a letter to Spencer Roane, Jefferson described the election as the, quote, revolution of 1800. He wrote that it, quote, was as real a revolution in the principles of our government, not affected indeed by the sword, but by the rational and peaceable instrument of reform, the suffrage of the people. Jefferson truly believed that his victory had maintained the principles the revolution established, and that he had defeated those who sought to tear them down. In reality, it's hard to say for sure how much credit Jefferson can be given for his victory. In fact, it's much easier to argue that Jefferson mainly won due to the unpopular policies of the Adams administration and the many uncertainties the country faced. The election could have in fact had a very different result had Adams's French peace envoys returned in time for the election, but one can only guess. Despite losing, Adams actually performed better than other Federalist candidates, which is a testament to the fact that he was generally well liked by a good portion of America. Alexander Hamilton would never recover politically from this brutal Federalist defeat and would retire from national politics. Aaron Burr, understandably, would end up being replaced on the 1804 ticket with George Clinton, the governor of New York. I'm guessing Jefferson wasn't too happy with his running mate attempting to undermine him. It would take until 1812 for the two former friends, heroes of the American Revolution, to start talking again. Adams wrote a letter to Jefferson, sparking a correspondence that continued until their deaths, both of which were on the 50th anniversary of American independence, on July 4th, 1826. The election of 1800 marked an important moment in American history, being the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political parties in the country's history. It also exposed a major flaw within the nation's constitution, one that would be fixed by the passing of the 12th Amendment in 1804, requiring separate votes for both president and vice president, ensuring that an 1800 situation would never be repeated. Thomas Jefferson's administration did not seem to change many aspects of the former regime, but he would go on to be an extremely popular president. He would win in a landslide in 1804, with a far less drama-filled campaign. To some, the election of 1800 may seem as an inherent positive. It was a referendum on Adams against his policies that sought to limit dissent and free speech, as well as other things. To others, the most important focus is that this election showed that America could switch governments peacefully. However, one rather sad fact about the 1800 election was that Jefferson quite possibly could have lost if it weren't for the 3/5 compromise. This law allowed states to count slaves as 3/5 of an American citizen. This would boost both their representation in the House as well as their number of electoral votes. The South tended to have a much higher slave population and, in this election, voted overwhelmingly for Jefferson. Therefore, there is a very good chance that, had this law not been in effect, that Jefferson would have in fact lost. It's a sad possibility about this election, but you can't change history. One of the most interesting things about this election is that it really shows how deeply ingrained smear campaigns are in American politics. Nowadays, it seems like political campaigns are nothing but two candidates attacking each other, instead of actually debating each other on policy. With this election in mind, it seems like this has been the case for quite a while in American politics. We tend to view politics from the past as being much more relaxed, when members of opposing parties could easily get along. But it seems like that isn't quite the truth. While it is definitely the case that politics is far more divisive nowadays, the presidency, having been the most powerful office in the United States, has and will continue to inspire candidates and their supporters to do everything in their power to win it, even if that requires smearing your opponent with every manner of falsehood. While doing research for this video, one of the sources I read included a really funny anecdote about a Federalist woman who so genuinely believed everything horrible she had heard about Jefferson in the Federalist newspapers that she attempted to hide her family's Bible with the only Democratic Republican she knew. When the man asked why, if Jefferson would destroy all the Bibles in America, would hers be safe with him, she simply replied, quote, "It will be perfectly safe with you. They'll never think of looking in the house of a Democrat for a Bible." It's a pretty funny story, if that's all it actually is. A story. If it's true, it's actually more worrying. If this is a real story, I think it really shows how much the polarizing nature of this election affected everyday Americans. It seems that partisan newspapers were already beginning to hold a big influence on the general populace, and many of the previous examples of pure propaganda were possibly taken serious by some, to such an extent that certain people were truly worried that the election of president would have a serious effect on their day-to-day lives, or even what religion they could practice. I'm not saying that this election wouldn't have an effect on the general populace. Jefferson would allow the Alien and Sedition Acts to expire and pardon those found guilty under them, but propaganda spread by these newspapers and hyper-partisans seemed to create a completely unjustified level of hysteria. If you want to take anything away from this video, it's that America's always been divided. The issues we disagree about may change from decade to decade, but in a country of any size, it's impossible for everyone to be happy about everything. Politics has always been polarizing, and always will be. Political parties' jobs are to distinguish themselves as much as possible from the opposition. By attempting to discredit those with different viewpoints, the goal is to simultaneously discredit those views themselves. When you're watching a video by a political pundit or a politician, always keep this in mind, and try to take what they say about their opposition with a grain of salt. It's always difficult to tell for sure what is the truth and what is simply being said for political gain. And with that being said, we come to the end of this video. I want to thank you all very much for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you again for staying around for the 40 minutes that it took to talk about this really interesting and kind of weird election. I had a really fun time making this video and doing all of the research behind it, and reading all of the really fun stories about this election. I really find this period of American history and American politics to be so very fascinating. And I hope that I've been able to share my fascination with you today by telling you about this really, really weird election. I hope that in the future I'll be able to make more videos like this, although maybe not as long as this. But in that case, I hope that I will see you again next time. Well, if there is a next time.